I'm Phil Morgan, a senior reporter with the Hillsdale Collegian. Here's my Q&A session with Canadian writer and political commentator Mark Steyn.
I think there's certainly a double standard. Bill Maher routinely uses the C word about Sarah Palin. I don't know why even. I mean, I don't. The things that are said about Sarah Palin's kid. The guy who was going to host the big dinner in Washington, whatever he's called, Louis CJ or whatever the guy's called, CK or whatever he's called. Uh, he did all these things about obscene tweets about Sarah Palin's intimate parts and her child. Uh, it's not just that there's a double standard. It's that it's a very bizarre world in which anybody could possibly think that calling Sarah Palin the C word is the height of wit. That's what aside from anything else, that's what I object to. I mean, I don't think it kind of passes muster as a joke. Generally speaking, I'm a kind of believer in civility, but I think that the right shouldn't get its knickers in a twist by making a virtue out of not playing by the left's rules. You know, we're losing. We on the right are losing the culture. The culture is coarse. 10 years ago, I would guess it is now, Janet Jackson got into trouble because she exposed a nipple at the Super Bowl. I have no view on the nipple one way or the other. I can, you know, if you drive through France, you'll pass billboards of topless women, and in America that would be advertising a strip joint or something for which the topless woman would be directly relevant. But in France, it could be just advertising a particular loaf of bread. You know, so you'll be looking at the topless woman, and she's advertising sliced bread or something. So I've got no view on the nipple one way or the other. What bothered me is that the 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 5 minutes of Janet Jackson prancing around the stage before she exposed the nipple was coarse and witless and charmless and crass and vulgar. And in a sense, I think the right have retreated. The right have said, oh, we're going to play by different rules, and we're not going to do this and we're not going to do that. And setting a higher standard for ourselves while popular culture decays and essentially the, the Bill Maher level of coarseness becomes the default mode of culture, I'm not sure is useful. I think in the end you can't accept the double standard, and you have to push back at these guys on their home turf. I mean, culture trumps economics every time, every time. Culture trumps economics, culture trumps politics. And the air we breathe Bill Maher's fetid air. It's very hard when you're breathing in Bill Maher's fetid air 365 days a year to then expect people to go and vote for a Conservative candidate on a Tuesday morning in November. So at some point the right has to have a strategy for taking back that side of the culture. I think I wrote that when I was down in Australia. I was down in Oz a couple of weeks ago, and it was interesting. Every time I went into an ABC show, ABC, I guess, is like their big public broadcaster. It's like the BBC or I guess maybe PBS, NPR over here. They all said, all the people said, well, how can Rick Santorum be a credible candidate for the presidency? He's so weird. And when you then actually ask them what it is that's weird about him, he's weird because he thinks marriage is between a man and a woman. He's weird because he thinks that the family is the basic building block of society. Those were things that you'd be amazed, but only the day before yesterday, people didn't consider that stuff weird at all. In fact, it was non-weird for almost all of human history. So what's interesting to me is is not Santorum's weirdness, but the fact that so much of what he says is now presumed to be weird, because I think he's right on the basics issue, which is that the crisis America faces is not primarily an accounting problem or a bookkeeping problem. We're broke for a reason. This country is the brokest nation in history because it is not the Republic of Limited Government and Self-Reliant Citizenry that Tocqueville observed 2 centuries ago. So he's right in that extent, that the brokenness is a symptom of the problem, not the problem. And in that sense, I don't find Santorum half as weird as 90% of his critics. No, I don't. If you mean by a serious civil rights issue, do you mean I think it's 1962 and Selma, Alabama? No, and nobody does except Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. Also, I should say the Reverend Al Sharpton and the Reverend Jesse Jackson. I don't quite know how long it's been since the Reverend Jackson was actually a practicing pastor at any church, but we're obliged to call him the Reverend Jackson for all eternity. These superannuated hucksters are making a very nice living out of this cobwebbed grievance mongering. What's interesting is that the rest of the world has moved on. There's no real white guy involved in this. They want you to think it's like a Klansman, a white racist killed some black guy. Well, he isn't. For a start, this guy is a registered Democrat. He's half Hispanic, which is why the New York Times has had to invent this phrase, quote, white Hispanic, unquote, for him, a phrase hitherto unknown to American journalism. It's never been used before in the New York Times, never been used in the Washington Post, never been used in the Chicago Tribune. White Hispanic was a phrase constructed, an ethnic category constructed so that this guy could still be white enough to fit the narrative of the Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton superannuated race huckstering. And it's pathetic because what's interesting about this story is that it shows America's moved on. Here we have, I mean, none of us knows the circumstances of this. As Jackson and Sharpton allege, did this guy racially profile the black teenager in the hoodie and take action? Maybe the black teenager in the hoodie racially profiled the middle-aged Hispanic coming towards him and thought, oh, I wonder what this is. Is this one of those big Latino drug dealer type guys one hears about so much in Florida? Maybe he racially profiled him. But either way, the idea that this fits some sort of Eisenhower template of Mr. and Mrs. White Picket Fence America being unable to get past their endemic race. It's not at all. This ought to be worth celebrate diversity. We've got here some kind of tragic murder, possibly a race crime, possibly racial bias. Who knows what it is? And no white Anglo-Saxon Protestant need be involved in it. Well, that's the Rainbow Coalition right there. I mean, America needs to. America will not move on beyond this. I mean, the president's statement is really quite disgraceful. I mean, it's a matter for this particular police department in Florida why he should feel, and he says, oh, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon Martin. Does it always have to come back to you, Mr. President? Is it all about you? And actually, would your son look? What do you mean your son would look like Trayvon Martin? What does that mean? That he'd have like, he'd have a gold tooth? What does that mean? I don't even understand it. The point is, none of us knows what it is. The idea that of sort of inflaming it is irresponsible. But inflaming it to invoke a half-century outdated stereotype of demographics in this country is completely absurd. Well, I'm the unassimilated immigrant in that respect. You know, I always have to be when I'm on Rush. I always have to be very careful because I always, you know, I'm talking about, you know, I always say, oh, Joe DiMaggio, who was one of the greatest players of American football ever, and then it turns out like the guy's a basketball player or something, and so I've always got to be a bit careful about that. I like the grace. I like the grace of baseball. I'm not a big fan of. I probably shouldn't say this as a Rush guest host because Rush certainly is. I'm not such a big fan of American football. I prefer rugby to American football. I played rugby for a long time. I always I like the way you don't play it with helmets and you get that old boot crushing into your skull right direct without having to wear any of those shoulder pads or anything. I played cricket in Bermuda recently for the first time in many years and enjoyed it enormously. And so I'm slightly, and I would like, and although I'm not a big fan of Afghan social life generally, I've always wanted to have a go at bushkazi, where, you know, that thing, it's like polo, but it's played with like a cow's head or a goat's head. And it's in pretty bad shape generally by the end of the polo match. But I've always quite liked the idea. The guys are on horseback and they're just thwacking this carcass around. I think they start off, generally only the head is left, but I think they start off with most of the carcass, but bits of it drop off along the way. And on the whole, I would say I prefer a good game of bushkazi to your average, to the Super Bowl. I'm not saying, you know, I don't want to sound un-American. I'm just saying, you know, if the Super Bowl guys want an idea how to freshen it up, instead of the lame-o Clint Eastwood Detroit ads and all the other nonsense, you know, why don't you have like the Kandahar Bushkazi team versus the Jalalabad Bushkazi team, and have all your tedious ads with Clint Eastwood and Janet Jackson and everything in between. It could be big bucks. I'm just throwing some ideas out here. We got to do something for this moribund economy. I think it's interesting to me that you understand when C.S. Lewis wrote *The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe* and all the rest of it, that what is the core underpinning of that narrative. You understand differently, but in the same way that there is a profound meaning underpinning Tolkien and Middle Earth. And that means that it's fine. People don't have to believe that. Liam Neeson, who does the voice of Aslan in the Narnia movies, says, "Oh, all this Christian stuff is a lot of hooey, and I don't think that's what it's about at all." That's fine. When something is about something, it's easy to play off it and say, "No, it isn't about that at all." But it seems to me that there is something empty at the heart of the Hunger Games, in that, in the end, the stakes aren't big enough for it to quite work as a kind of there's nothing primal at stake in the Hunger Games, in part because I assume the author has no particular transcendent meaning to life, doesn't subscribe to any, and I think there's a kind of absence of that in the book. Yeah, and I think trivial stories are always about something big. When I was a child, I loved the Prisoner of Zenda, which is about a kind of English gentleman who's on a vacation in Central Europe and winds up standing in for a king at his coronation in Ruritania. And I loved it because it was not just because of the dash and swagger and the swashbuckling, but because there's something big at the heart of the story, that in a sense duty and honour compel a man to behave in certain ways. Well, about 10 years ago, they remade that as the movie Dave, in which Kevin Kline gets to pretend to be the President of the United States. And instead of the movie being about duty and honour and all the rest of it, it's about getting Congress to pass an affordable housing bill. And I'm sorry, but you just can't hang, you can't hang something mythic and primal on that. And that's the great, I think that's the curse of sort of, and that's why I have a theory that all effective storytelling is conservative, whether the author knows it or not, because there are in a conservative world there are consequences to what you do. In a 19th century social novel, a girl goes to a dance and she happens to accept a dance from the wrong man, and her entire life changes because of the consequences of the choice she made. Now there are no consequences to anything. You know, if you wake up in the morning and decide you want to be a woman, you can become a woman, and Obamacare will probably pay for it. So so you can't really have. I don't think you can have effective storytelling in that kind of a world, because you can't. Drama depends on consequences. And if, as many liberals do, you believe in a world without consequences and individual responsibility, it's very hard to have effective story.